Proverbs 17, verses 1 through 14, there are so many contrasts. In fact, it seems like there's a different contrast in every verse. And I must confess, this is the hardest section yet to find a common theme or thread that runs through all of these verses. And so for the big picture counsel, the closest thing I can see as a thread that runs through all these verses is that man tests character by height, but God tests character by depth. We have a tendency as human beings to look at external factors to determine what kind of person someone is. So maybe we do look at their physical height and appearance, like Israel did with King Saul, and we assume because they're tall, dark, and handsome that they've got a great character. We'll also look at people's bank accounts to determine their character, or their talents, or their accomplishments, which are all very superficial measures of one's heart. But God looks past all of that and has a totally different standard for measuring people's hearts. So for instance, in verse 1, if we see a house full of feasting and there are rich people there, we assume their lives must be great and they must be really good people to have made all that money, when in reality, they're at each other's throats, constantly in conflict with one another because they're not good people. Likewise, in verse 2, we assume that a son is going to gain the inheritance because he has the birthright and he was raised under his father's rules, and genetically, he should be predisposed to have the same character that his father has. But that's not always the case. Sometimes the son is a terrible person, and the inheritance goes to a servant, the most unexpected person, because the servant has far better character than the son. God does not test our character based on our position in society, but based on the kind of heart we have. Because in verse 3, God is the tester of hearts. Just as gold and silver are burned to test their quality and to refine them and make them better, so too God knows the quality of our character, and sometimes he uses the refining fires of trials to sharpen and improve our character. But the irony is, when man looks upon God's tests of our character, man assumes we're going through all that because we have bad character. But God's measuring our character by a completely different metric than man is. Man measures character based on what's happening to people in their lives. If good things are happening, they must have good character. If bad things are happening, they must have bad character. But that's not how God views it at all. God's not just looking at height. He's looking at depth. In verse 4, sometimes we judge people's character simply by the words that they use. And while it's true, most of the time our words come from our hearts, sometimes words can be deceptive, and people can lie and make their words sound so convincing. And so we assume they're great people and we listen to them. But God wants us to look past what they're saying to the depth of their character so that we won't listen to destructive speech. In verse 5, sometimes people mock the poor because they assume they're cursed by God and they must deserve whatever calamity has happened to them. But God's not looking at that person's poverty as the measure of their character. He's looking at their hearts. And if we mock poor people, we're mocking God, in whose image that poor person was created. And in verse 6, most people would assume the crown of old men would be their accomplishments in the world. What great things did they do in society? But God says actually their grandchildren are the real crown. And I think the assumption here is that they have wise grandchildren. God cares far more about leaving behind a legacy of wisdom than he does our earthly achievements. And the true glory of sons is to have wise fathers that they can look up to for approval and guidance. So there's actually a balance here, because if he said the glory of fathers is their sons, that would be true and it would match up with the first part of the verse. But then it might give the impression that what matters to God the most is how many children you have. But again, that's an external measure by height. And what God wants more than a father having many children is for him to be a good and wise and honorable father that brings glory to their sons. In verse 7, we might assume a prince has good character, but sometimes they're liars. In verse 8, we might assume someone who has physical prosperity has great character, but it could be he's just going around bribing everyone. In verse 9, we assume someone who's in in the know and who has insider information must have good character because he's got all these close relationships. And maybe they even share that insider information in a way that makes them sound righteous. Maybe they say, hey, pray for so-and-so because they committed this sin and I'm really concerned about them. According to man's measure of their character, that makes them sound like a great person. But in reality, they're sharing secrets they have no business sharing, and they're actually disrespecting their friend, and it's going to destroy their relationship. In verses 10 through 13, sometimes we look at fools and they seem great because they're so confident and they don't seem to need any guidance from God. They just march to the beat of their own drum, and you almost admire people who are so independent. But God sees through all of that and says, actually, the fact that they don't listen to anyone is a sign of their folly because they can't even hear correction or rebuke. They are rebels against all authority, and God's going to send a cruel messenger against them. Verse 11, we don't know exactly what messenger he's talking about there. It could be a person that the king sends to go get him and bring him in for judgment. It could refer to an angelic being sent by God to bring divine punishment down on him. But either way, these people that society sometimes looks up to should not be looked up to at all because they're incredibly dangerous. In verse 12, it's far better to have a run-in with a bear who's been robbed of her cubs than it is to be around a fool, because God's going to ensure that evildoers bring evil down upon their own house. And finally, in verse 14, sometimes we measure people's character by their ability to argue and to always be right and to make great logical points. But God says, actually, it's far better to avoid the argument in the first place because it just creates strife, which ties everything back to verse 1. And so the challenge for us is to not measure people's character by height, but rather by depth, which means we don't assume just because they're tall, good looking, rich, in a high position in their company, if they're famous and on TV and in the movies and everyone knows them, or if they're great public speakers and their rhetoric is so persuasive and powerful. No, those are all measures of height. And if we only measure by height, we're going to hitch ourselves to the wrong people. We'll end up following religious leaders with bad character, or marrying someone with bad character, or hitching ourselves to a political leader with bad character, or surrounding ourselves with friends who have bad character. And when God brings them down, we're going to go down with them. And this points to Christ, because in his day, everyone was measuring character by height and not depth. And so they measured Jesus's character by external factors, like the fact that he came from Nazareth, and they said, can anything good come out of Nazareth? And they saw that he was lowly and poor and didn't look like a king on the outside, and assumed he did not have the character to be the Messiah. But of course, the Pharisees were rich and influential, and they were in the elite religious positions. So everyone assumed they were the ones with the best character and hearts. But Jesus exposed their real character. He tested them in the refining fires of truth. And in Luke 16, Jesus knew that the Pharisees were lovers of money, and he said in verse 15, you are those who justify yourselves in the sight of men, but God knows your hearts. For that which is highly esteemed among men is detestable in the sight of God. So as we call on God for wisdom, our prayer today is, Father, help me never to measure my character or the character of others based on shallow, superficial standards, but instead by the depth of your standard found in your word. And as scary as this is to pray, if my heart is not right and my character is shallow and superficial, I pray that you will do whatever you need to do to refine me like silver and gold, to remove every impurity so I can have depth of character and heart just like your Son.